chill you, it kills you. Declan Mercer, the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, was walking with his 6-year-old daughter when she suddenly stopped. She wasn't looking at the lights. She wasn't looking at the snow. She was looking into a dark alley. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Her baby is freezing." He turned, and what he saw behind that dumpster made every muscle in his body go still, because he knew that woman. She had worked in his home. She had held his daughter's hand. And 7 months ago, she vanished without a word. No one knew why, until tonight. The cold arrived like something with teeth. It was the kind of February night that didn't just chill you. It crawled inside your bones and sat there, patient and mean, like it had nowhere else to be. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees by 7 o'clock, and by 9, it felt like the city itself was holding its breath, afraid that if it exhaled, everything would shatter. The streets of downtown were mostly empty. A few cabs slid through intersections like ghosts. The neon signs on the storefronts flickered against the black sky, casting pale halos on the frozen sidewalks. Every surface was glazed with a thin layer of ice that caught the light and turned it into something cruel, beautiful and deadly at the same time. Declan Mercer walked through this cold like a man who owned it. He was 33 years old, broad-shouldered and sharp-jawed, with dark hair cut close and eyes the color of winter itself, gray, unyielding, incapable of seeing through every lie a person could tell. He wore a black wool overcoat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, tailored to fit the kind of body that was built through discipline rather than vanity. His shoes clicked against the ice with the precision of someone who never stumbled. Everyone in this city knew his name. Declan Mercer was the head of the Mercer family, an organization that had controlled the eastern seaboard's underground economy for 3 generations. In real estate, logistics, finance, influence, the Mercers didn't deal in street-level chaos. They dealt in power, the quiet, immovable kind that made judges pause before signing warrants and made politicians return phone calls within the hour. He was feared, and he knew it. He was respected, and he'd earned it. He was ruthless when he needed to be, merciful when it served him, and silent in a way that made people more afraid than any threat ever could. But tonight, Declan wasn't a crime lord. Tonight, he was a father. His daughter, Lily, walked beside him with her small hand buried inside his enormous one. She was 6 years old, with dark curls that spilled out from under a cream-colored knit hat, and brown eyes that were too big, too observant, too alive for a child her age. She wore a burgundy coat with faux fur lining, matching gloves and boots that had been waterproofed before they left the house, because Declan Mercer might not fear anything on earth, but he feared his daughter catching cold. They'd just left Marchetti's, a private Italian restaurant on West 54th Street, where the owner kept a reserved table for Declan in a back room with no windows and 2 exits. Lily had ordered spaghetti with extra parmesan and a chocolate mousse that left a brown smudge on the tip of her nose. Declan had wiped it off with his thumb while she giggled, and for 30 seconds, the most dangerous man in the city had been nothing but soft. "Daddy, my tummy is so full I think I'm going to pop," Lily said, swinging their joined hands as they walked. "If you pop, I'll just put you back together," Declan said. "You can't put a person back together. That's not how it works." "Watch me," she laughed. That sound, high and clear and entirely untouched by the darkness that surrounded his life, was the only thing in the world that could make Declan Mercer close his eyes and breathe like a man at peace. Behind them, roughly 20 paces back, 2 men in dark overcoats followed at a practiced distance. Ronan and Ives, Declan's personal security. They were armed, alert, and invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Their breath rose in clouds. Their eyes moved in synchronized sweeps. Left, right, roofline, vehicle, pedestrian. They'd been doing this long enough to do it without thinking. Declan's car was parked 2 blocks away, and he'd chosen to walk tonight because Lily had asked him to. Because she'd said she wanted to see the city at night, with all its lights, and he was constitutionally incapable of refusing her anything that didn't involve sugar past 8 o'clock. They turned onto a quieter street. The buildings here were older, brownstones converted into offices, a shuttered laundromat, a bodega with a half-lit sign. The sidewalk narrowed. The streetlights buzzed. And then Lily stopped. It wasn't gradual. And she didn't slow down first. She simply stopped walking, mid-step, like someone had pressed pause on the world. Her hand tightened inside Declan's, not a squeeze, a grip. The kind of grip a child makes when something bypasses their brain and goes straight to their heart. "Lily," Declan said, already scanning. His body shifted. His weight dropped slightly. One hand moved toward his coat's inner pocket instinctively. But Lily wasn't looking at danger. She was looking into a narrow alley between two buildings, barely 6 feet wide, filled with shadow and the metal glint of a dumpster. A thin strip of light from the street cut diagonally across the ground, illuminating a pile of flattened cardboard boxes, a torn black garbage bag, and something else. Something human. Lily's lips parted. Her breath came out in a small white cloud that dissolved into nothing. "Daddy," she whispered. Her voice was so small, it almost broke before it reached him. "Ha, Daddy. Her baby is freezing." Declan followed her gaze. There, behind the dumpster, curled into a space barely wide enough for a dog, was a woman. She was sitting on the ground with her back against the brick wall, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around something pressed tight against her body. Her head was bowed, her hair, dark blonde, tangled, unwashed, hung over her face like a curtain. One of them had snapped and been retied in. One of them had snapped and been retied in a knot that was already coming undone again. In her arms, bundled inside a blanket so thin it could have been a bedsheet, was a baby. The baby was tiny, 3 months old, maybe 4. Its face was barely visible, just a sliver of skin between the edge of the blanket and the woman's chest. But even in that sliver, Declan could see it, the faint, rhythmic trembling that ran through the infant's body. Not crying, not fussing, just shaking, quietly, persistently. The way something shakes when it has been cold for so long that it has forgotten what warmth feels like. The woman was shaking too. Her fingers, red and raw, the nails broken, were curled around the blanket's edge, in holding it in place with a grip that spoke of desperation that had long since passed into numbness. She was asleep, or close to it. That dangerous kind of sleep that the cold brings, where the body starts shutting down one system at a time, quietly, efficiently, like a building turning off its lights floor by floor. Declan stared, and something in his chest moved. It wasn't a feeling he recognized immediately. It wasn't anger, which he knew the way a musician knows scales. It wasn't calculation, which was his native language. It was something older, something that existed underneath the armor he'd spent his entire adult life building. Then, the woman shifted slightly in her sleep, and her hair fell away from her face, and the strip of light from the street caught her features, and Declan Mercer felt the ground beneath his feet tilt. He knew that face. Her name was Briar Ashwood, and 7 months ago, she had worked in his home. To understand what Declan felt in that moment, the precise, tectonic shift that happened behind his ribs, you need to understand who Briar Ashwood had been inside the Mercer household. She'd come to work for him 11 months earlier, hired through a domestic staffing agency that catered to high-net-worth clients. The kind of agency that ran criminal background checks, credit reports, and reference verifications before they'd even schedule an interview. Briar had passed everything with flying colors. 25 years old. No criminal record. A former child care worker at a private daycare in New Jersey. Excellent references. Quiet, reliable, punctual. She'd been hired as the household assistant, a role that was equal parts housekeeper, organizer, and, unofficially, part-time nanny whenever Declan's primary child care team needed support. The Mercer estate was a sprawling property, in the wealthy enclaves of Greenwich, Connecticut. 12 acres behind a stone wall, with a gated entrance, staffed by a security team. A head housekeeper named Mrs. Calloway, a chef, a groundskeeper, and 3 rotating members of Declan's personal guard. It was the kind of place where people spoke in low voices and moved with purpose, a place where order was religion. Briar had fit into this world the way water fits into a glass, quietly, without disturbing anything. She arrived at 6:30 every morning and left by 6 in the evening. She cleaned with the meticulous care of someone who took pride in invisible work. She organized closets by color and season. She polished surfaces that were already clean. She never broke anything, never showed up late, and never once asked for anything beyond her paycheck. But the thing about Briar Ashwood, the thing that made her different from every other staff member who had cycled through the Mercer household, was Lily. Lily had lost her mother, Catherine Mercer, Declan's wife, had died when Lily was 2 years old. An aneurysm. Sudden. No warning. Well, one morning she was laughing and pouring orange juice, and by that afternoon she was gone. It was the kind of death that didn't just take a person. It rearranged every molecule in the room, the house, the life it left behind. Declan had handled it the way he handled everything, with control. He'd planned the funeral with military precision. He'd ensured Lily's routine stayed the same. He'd hired the best child psychologist in the state. He'd held his daughter every night until she fell asleep. And then he'd gone to his office and sat in the dark until the grief loosened its grip, just enough for him to breathe again. He'd never remarried. He'd never even dated, not because he was devastated, though he had been, but because after Catherine, he'd decided that Lily would never have to compete for his attention. She was the center, the only center. But there was a consequence to this, despite the nannies, the tutors, the staff, and the therapist. Lily had grown up surrounded by professionals. People who were paid to care for her. People who were kind, competent, and efficient, but who clocked out at the end of their shift and went home to their own lives. Lily, even at 5, had sensed the difference between duty and love. She had become polite, but reserved. Friendly, but guarded. She didn't misbehave, but she didn't light up either, until Briar. It had started on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Declan was in his office on the 2nd floor when he heard something through the open window that he hadn't heard in months. Lily, laughing, not the polite, performative laugh she used with guests, not the quiet giggle she saved for bedtime stories. This was the real one, the belly laugh, the head thrown back laugh, the kind that made her eyes crinkle and her whole body shake. He'd gone to the window and looked down into the garden. Briar was on her knees in the grass. She was telling Lily some kind of story. He was a little embarrassed. She was telling Lily some kind of story. He couldn't hear the words, just the rhythm of her voice, and Lily was listening with the intense, wide-eyed focus that children reserve for the few adults they truly trust. Declan had stood at that window for 10 minutes without moving. After that, he noticed everything. And he noticed that Briar sang under her breath while she folded laundry, soft, absent-minded melodies that drifted through the hallway like smoke. He noticed that she always left a glass of milk and a cookie on the kitchen counter at 3:15 p.m., exactly when Lily came downstairs from her lessons. He noticed that she'd started reading to Lily in the afternoons, not because she'd been asked to, but because Lily had asked her. And he noticed that Lily had started drawing pictures that included a figure with yellow hair and a blue dress, Briar's uniform, standing next to a small girl with dark curls. He noticed that his daughter was happy. And Declan, who trusted almost no one, who evaluated every person in his life through the lens of loyalty and threat assessment, had allowed it. Because Briar was genuine, he could see it, not in one thing she did, but in everything. In the way she looked at Lily without performing. In the way she tidied a room without rushing. In the way she said good morning to him every day, brief, respectful, with a small nod, and never once tried to impress him, flatter him, or make herself seem more important than she was. She was, in his assessment, a fundamentally decent person, and in Declan's world, that was rarer than diamonds. Then, 4 months after she'd started, Briar left. It had happened on a Wednesday. She'd arrived at work that morning looking pale and distracted. Mrs. H. 47 p.m. She'd walked into Mrs. at 1:47 p.m. She'd walked into Mrs. Calloway's office and handed in her resignation, effective immediately. No 2 weeks' notice, no explanation, no forwarding address. Mrs. Calloway had been stunned. Briar, is something wrong? Has something happened? No, Briar had said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I need to go. I'm sorry. Please tell Lily I'm sorry. And she'd walked out. Declan had been in a meeting when it happened. By the time he found out, Briar was gone. Her locker was empty. Her phone number had been disconnected by the following day. The staffing agency said she'd terminated her contract and provided no reason. He'd been angry, not at the inconvenience. Staff could be replaced. He'd been angry because Lily had cried for 3 days. And she'd kept asking where Briar went. She'd kept looking for her in the garden, in the kitchen, in the hallway where Briar used to hum those quiet songs. "Where's Briar, Daddy?" Lily had asked on the first night. "Is she coming back?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Did she leave because of me?" That question had hit Declan like a bullet, because he'd seen the guilt in his daughter's eyes, the irrational, devastating belief that if someone you love leaves, it must be your fault. And he'd held her and told her that wasn't true, that Briar had her own life and her own reasons, that sometimes people go away and it has nothing to do with us. But privately, he'd been furious. Not at Briar specifically, but at the fact that she'd gotten close enough to his daughter to leave a wound, and then she'd vanished without even trying to close it. He'd told himself to let it go. People come and go. That's what happens. Move on. And he had. Or he'd thought he had. Until tonight. Until he was standing on a frozen sidewalk, looking at Briar Ashwood curled up behind a dumpster, with a baby in her arms and ice on her eyelashes, and every question he'd buried came roaring back to the surface like a wave. "Daddy." Lily tugged his hand. "Daddy, we have to help her." Declan didn't move immediately. His mind was doing what it always did, running calculations, threat, context, exposure. His daughter was standing on a public sidewalk at 9 o'clock at night. His security team was 20 paces behind him. There was a woman in an alley who might be sick, might be dangerous, might be carrying a stolen child, might be 100 things that his survival instincts told him to consider before his heart could override them. But then the baby made a sound. It wasn't a cry. It was smaller than a cry. It was a thin, reedy whimper. The kind of sound that a newborn makes when it has been crying for so long that it doesn't have the energy left to do it properly. It was the sound of something tiny and helpless running out of reserves. And Lily's hand tightened around his so hard that he felt her fingernails through his leather gloves. "Please, Daddy." Declan looked down at his daughter. Her eyes were full, not quite crying, but right at the edge. That trembling, shimmering look that children get when they've encountered something they don't have the words for, something that feels too big and too wrong and too sad. He crouched beside her. He brought his face level with hers. "Stay right here," he said quietly. "With Ronan. Don't move." He gave a short hand signal behind him without turning around. Ronan was at Lily's side in 3 seconds. Ives moved to cover the mouth of the alley. Declan stood and walked into the alley alone. The cold was worse in here. The buildings on either side blocked whatever faint warmth the city generated. Funneling the wind was slick with ice and something darker, runoff maybe, or spilled garbage. The smell was sharp, old food, wet concrete, the acrid tang of cold metal. He stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, she looked worse than she'd looked from the sidewalk. The hoodie she was wearing was damp, not from rain, but from the kind of persistent, seeping cold that draws moisture from the air and plants it in fabric. Her jeans were filthy, and her skin had a grayish pallor that Declan recognized. because he'd seen it before, on men who'd been left in cold storage rooms for too long. It was the color of a body redirecting blood from the surface to the core. The color of survival mode. Her lips were slightly blue. The baby was pressed against her chest, held in place by arms that were locked so tight they looked almost rigid. The blanket around the infant was a pale yellow, thin cotton, the kind you'd use in summer. And it was hopelessly inadequate for this temperature. Through the fabric, Declan could see the baby's tiny body trembling in a constant, involuntary rhythm. He crouched down. "Briar." His voice was low, controlled. The same voice he used in negotiations, calm enough to reach someone without startling them. She didn't respond. "Briar Ashwood." Her eyelids fluttered. A small crease appeared between her brows, like the sound of her name had traveled a long way to reach her and arrived battered. And then her eyes opened. They were green. He'd forgotten that. A pale, clear green like shallow water over sand. But now they were bloodshot and glassy, and it took them several seconds to focus. They moved slowly, tracking from the ground to his shoes, to his knees, to his face, and when they finally locked onto his, something happened in them that Declan had never seen in another human being. It was recognition, and then, immediately, terror. Not the terror of someone seeing a dangerous man. The terror of someone who has been caught at their lowest, the raw, animal horror of being seen in a state of complete vulnerability by the one person they'd spent months pretending didn't exist. "No," she breathed. The word came out cracked, barely audible. "No, no, no, no." She tried to move, tried to push herself deeper into the wall, like she could phase through brick if she just pressed hard enough. Her arms tightened around the baby. Her breathing went shallow and fast, the beginning of a panic response that her exhausted body could barely sustain. "Mr. Mercer, please, Stop," Declan said. Not harsh, firm, the kind of word that catches a person mid-spiral and gives them something solid to hold. "Stop. Breathe." She stared at him. Her chest heaved. Tears were running down her face, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, exhausted kind that happen when a person has nothing left to hold them back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean, I didn't know you'd be Briar." He said her name again, and this time it came out different, softer, not a command, but an anchor. "Your baby is freezing. We need to move. Can you stand?" She looked down at the bundle in her arms, as though she'd temporarily forgotten it was there. And then her face crumbled. "I can't feel my hands," she said. "I can't. I don't know if I can hold him. My fingers aren't—" Declan didn't hesitate. He removed his overcoat, $5,000 of Italian wool, and wrapped it around her shoulders and the baby in one motion. The coat swallowed her. She almost disappeared inside it. Then he put his hand under her elbow and lifted. She weighed nothing. It was like picking up a paper bag. Whatever she'd been eating in recent months, if she'd been eating at all, it hadn't been enough. She stood, swayed, her knees buckled, and he caught her, one arm around her waist, steady and sure. I've got you," he said. "Walk." They emerged from the alley into the streetlight, and Lily was there waiting, her face a mask of 6-year-old intensity, that look children get when they're trying so hard to be brave, that their bravery becomes its own kind of heartbreak. Lily looked at Briar, at the baby, at her father supporting a woman who could barely stand. And then, very quietly, Lily did something that would define the rest of this story. She stepped forward, reached up, and placed her small hand on the baby's blanket. She didn't pat it. She didn't squeeze. She just let her hand rest there, gently, like she was telling the baby, "I'm here. You're not alone anymore." "Hi," she whispered to the baby. "It's okay, my daddy's going to fix everything. He always does." Briar's eyes met Declan's over the top of Lily's head. In that look was everything she couldn't say. The shame, The gratitude, the fear, the exhaustion, and the desperate hope that this wasn't a dream brought on by hypothermia. Declan held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he turned to Ives and spoke in the tone that moved empires. "Bring the car around." Now. The black SUV arrived in under 90 seconds. Ives had radioed ahead to Marcus, the driver who'd been circling the block, and by the time the vehicle pulled to the curb, its interior was already blasting heat. Declan guided Briar into the back seat with the same careful precision he applied to everything. He didn't rush her. He didn't speak. He simply kept his hand on her arm, firm enough to steady her, light enough to let go if she flinched, and helped her settle into the leather seat. The moment the heated air hit her, Briar's body reacted. She started shaking harder. Well, not less, harder. That was the paradox of rewarming. When the cold finally begins to release its grip, the body rebels. The muscles that have been locked in survival mode start to spasm. Blood that has been hoarded by the core rushes outward, and the nerve endings scream. Her teeth chattered so violently that the sound filled the entire vehicle. Lily climbed in beside her without being told. She sat close, not touching, but close enough that Briar could feel her there. She didn't ask questions. She didn't chatter. She just sat, watchful and still, her eyes moving between Briar's face and the baby's blanket. Declan got in on the other side. Ronan took the front passenger seat. Ives would follow in the second car. "Home," Declan said to Marcus. "Direct route, no stops." "Yes, sir." The SUV pulled away from the curb and merged into the sparse nighttime traffic, its tires crunching over ice. For the first 5 minutes, no one spoke. Declan watched Briar from the corner of his eye. She was holding the baby against her chest with both arms, the overcoat still draped around her like a tent. Her head was bowed. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at a point on the seat in front of her that held no interest. She looked like someone who had stopped trying to understand what was happening and was simply allowing it to happen. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in men who'd been beaten, not physically, though sometimes that too, but beaten by circumstances, by the relentless accumulation of days that went wrong, one after another, until the weight of them compressed the spirit into something flat and numb. He didn't like seeing it on her. It was Lily who broke the silence. "Is the baby a boy or a girl?" she asked quietly. Briar blinked. It took a moment for the question to reach her, as if sound had to travel through deep water. "A boy," she said. Her voice was hoarse, raw. "His name is Theo." "Theo?" Lily repeated, like she was tasting the word. "That's a good name. Is he cold?" "He—" Briar's voice broke, and she pressed her lips together hard, fighting for control. "He was cold. He's warming up now." "Good. Because babies aren't supposed to be cold. Mrs. Halloran at school says babies need to be warm all the time or their tiny bodies don't work right." Briar looked at Lily, really looked at her for the first time, and whatever she saw in that small, earnest face, the unapologetic kindness of a child who hadn't yet learned to ration her compassion, something in Briar's expression shifted. Declan said nothing. He kept his eyes on Declan, said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road through the window, but he heard every word, and each one landed somewhere he couldn't protect. At some point during the drive, the baby began to stir, not cry, stir, small movements, the kind of restless, instinctive shifting that infants do when their environment changes and their half-formed nervous system tries to make sense of it. A tiny hand appeared at the edge of the blanket, fingers so small they looked like they'd been drawn with a fine-point pen, and grasped at the air. Lily reached over and touched the hand with her index finger. The baby's fingers closed around it. Lily gasped, not a loud gasp, a reverent one. The kind of sound people make in churches or museums, when something strikes them as holy. "Daddy," she whispered. "He's holding my finger. He's so strong." Declan looked. He saw his daughter's finger wrapped in the grip of an infant who, 20 minutes ago, had been shaking behind a dumpster in 9-degree weather. He saw the look on Lily's face, wonder and protectiveness and love all at once, in proportions that only a child can produce. And he saw Briar watching them both with an expression that was so full of pain and gratitude that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. He turned back to the window, but his jaw was tight, and his hands, resting on his knees, had curled into fists, because Declan Mercer was beginning to understand something. Whatever had happened to Briar Ashwood, whatever had driven her from his home and landed her in that alley, it wasn't a story about bad luck. It wasn't a story about poor choices. It was a story about something that had been done to her. And Declan Mercer had very specific feelings about people who did things to people who couldn't defend themselves. The Mercer estate materialized through the fog like a fortress emerging from a dream. The stone walls, the iron gate, the long, curved driveway lined with bare maple trees whose branches looked like black veins against the sky. In every window in the main house was lit. Declan had called ahead, and the warm glow spilling across the frozen lawn looked like the promise of safety made visible. The car stopped under the portico. Marcus opened Briar's door, and the wave of heated air from the house reached her before she even stepped out. She stood on the flagstone and looked up at the building, this massive, elegant, intimidating structure, and the expression on her face was one of someone who has been drowning and suddenly feels sand beneath their feet. She didn't trust it. You could see it in her eyes, the way drowning people don't trust solid ground at first, because the water has taught them that nothing is stable. Mrs. Calloway was waiting at the front door. She was 62 years old, built like a cathedral pillar. And she'd run the Mercer household for 15 years with the precision of a Swiss watch and the empathy of a good grandmother. She took one look at Briar and the baby, and her face underwent a transformation that Declan had only seen a handful of times, a softening so complete that it erased every line of authority and replaced it with pure maternal instinct. "Oh, child," Mrs. Calloway said. It was all she said. Handle something fragile, and guided her handle something fragile, and guided her inside. The next hour was organized chaos. Mrs. Calloway had, in the 20 minutes between Declan's call and his arrival, mobilized the household with the efficiency of a field commander. The guest suite on the second floor, the one with the bay window and the bathroom with the heated floors, had been prepared. Clean sheets, for fresh towels. The thermostat set to 74 degrees. A space heater placed in the corner, angled toward the bed. She'd also contacted Dr. Nuri Amara, the Mercer family's private physician, who arrived within 40 minutes. Dr. Amara was calm, efficient, and utterly unflappable. A woman who had treated gunshot wounds in the same tone of voice she used to discuss cholesterol levels. She examined the baby first. Theo was underweight, mildly dehydrated, and showing early signs of hypothermia, core temperature 2 degrees below normal, but responsive. His reflexes were intact. His lungs were clear. He was, against all odds, essentially healthy. "He's resilient," Dr. Amara said, swaddling him in a warm blanket with practiced hands. But another hour in that cold, and we'd be having a very different conversation. That sentence hit the room like a stone dropped in still water. Briar, sitting on the edge of the bed where Mrs. Calloway had placed her. I pressed them together as if in prayer. Doctor 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 pressed them together as if in prayer. Dr. Amara examined Briar next. She was underweight, significantly. Her blood pressure was low. She had mild frostbite on 3 fingers and both earlobes. She was exhausted to a degree that bordered on medical concern. She hadn't eaten a full meal in what appeared to be several days. But she was alive, she was conscious, and when Dr. Amara asked her questions, she answered them. Quietly, carefully, with the precise diction of someone who is holding themselves together through sheer willpower. When did you last eat? Yesterday morning, half a bagel. I gave the rest to. I made sure Theo had formula. Where have you been sleeping? A pause. Different places, shelters when there's room. The last 2 nights, outside. In this weather? Briar didn't answer. She didn't need to. Declan stood in the hallway outside the guest suite, listening. He'd positioned himself just beyond the door frame, close enough to hear, far enough to give the illusion of privacy. His arms were crossed. His face was neutral. But anyone who knew him well enough to read the small signs, the tightness around his eyes, the slight forward tilt of his head, the absolute stillness of his body, would have recognized what was happening inside him. He was angry, not at Briar, not at the situation. And was in her pajamas now. Flannel pants was in her pajamas now. Flannel pants with tiny elephants on them, and a long-sleeve shirt that said, "Adventure awaits," in glittery letters. Her hair was down, a wild tangle of dark curls, and she was carrying a stuffed bear that she'd had since she was 2. "Daddy," she said, "can I give Mr. Bear to the baby? He's warm and soft, and I think the baby needs him more than me right now." Declan looked at her. This child, his child, offering her most treasured possession to a stranger's baby, without a moment's hesitation. "You sure?" he asked. "That's your favorite." "I know. That's why I want to give him. Because you should give your best things to people who need them." Declan knelt so that his face was level with hers. He looked at her for a long moment. This small person who somehow, then despite growing up and surrounded by bodyguards and bulletproof glass and the constant, invisible machinery of organized crime, had arrived at a moral clarity that most adults would spend their entire lives failing to achieve. "You're a better person than me," he said quietly. "No, I'm not," she said. "You brought her here. That's the same thing." She slipped past him and into the guest suite. Through the doorway, he watched her walk up to the bed where Briar was sitting, place Mr. Bear carefully beside the sleeping baby, and whisper, "He'll keep you safe tonight." Briar looked at the stuffed bear, then at Lily. And then she did something she'd been fighting not to do since the alley. She broke, Not dramatically, not loudly. She simply lowered her head and let the tears fall, heavy, silent. It's uncontrollable. While her shoulders shook and her hands gripped the edge of the mattress, and everything she'd been carrying alone for months came crashing down in the safety of a room that was warm and clean and watched over by a 6-year-old girl with a heart bigger than the house she lived in. Lily didn't flinch. She climbed onto the bed, sat beside Briar, and leaned her head against the woman's arm. "It's okay," she said. "You're safe now." In the hallway, Declan closed his eyes. And then he pulled out his phone and made 3 calls. She didn't tell him everything that night. She couldn't. The story was too large and she was too depleted. And there are some truths that can only be spoken in fragments, handed over one piece at a time, like a confession that the body releases only when it's certain the listener can bear the weight. But over the next 2 days, the picture emerged. His name was Craig Devlin. Briar had married him when she was 22, and they'd met through mutual friends at a barbecue in Hoboken. He was 28, charming, attentive, and funny, in the way that made everyone in the room want to stand closer to him. He was a project manager at a construction firm. He drove a pickup truck that he kept spotless. He opened doors for her. He brought flowers on Tuesdays because, he said, everyone brings flowers on weekends and that's not special. For 6 months, he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. And then, quietly, in increments so small, they were almost imperceptible, he became the worst. It started with opinions. He had opinions about everything: her clothes, her friends, her schedule, her phone usage. At first, the opinions sounded like concern. "You're really going to wear that? It's kind of revealing. That friend of yours, Megan, she's not a good influence. Why do you need your phone at dinner? I'm right here." Then the opinions became rules. No going out without telling him where. No talking to male co-workers outside of work. No visiting her mother without his approval. He monitored her texts. He tracked her location through an app he'd installed on her phone and told her was for safety. He controlled the finances. Every dollar she earned went into a joint account that only he had a debit card for. Then the rules became punishments. The first time he hit her was 9 months into the marriage. She'd come home 20 minutes late from the grocery store because of traffic. When he'd been standing in the kitchen when she walked in, and without a word, he'd backhanded her across the face with enough force to split her lower lip. Then he'd apologized. He'd cried. He'd held her. He'd said it would never happen again. It happened again. Over the next year, Craig Devlin dismantled Briar's life with the systematic precision of someone tearing down a building. He isolated her from her family, her mother, her sister, her 2 close friends. The woman who remained was a hollowed out. The woman who remained was a hollowed out version of the woman she'd been. Someone who flinched at sudden movements and apologized for breathing too loudly. The job at the Mercer estate had been her one act of defiance. She'd applied through the agency in secret, during one of the rare hours when Craig was at work and she had access to a computer. She'd used her sister's address for the paperwork. She'd told Craig she'd gotten a cleaning job at a commercial property, vague enough that he didn't investigate, specific enough that he didn't question the hours. For 4 months, working in the Mercer household had been the closest thing to freedom she'd experienced in years. The order of the house, the kindness of Mrs. Calloway, in the laughter of a little girl with dark curls who asked her to read stories and build forts, and who looked at her, really looked at her, like she mattered. And then Craig found out. No, he'd gone through her phone, something he did regularly, like a landlord inspecting property. He'd found a text from Mrs. Calloway confirming a schedule change. He'd searched the name. He'd found the Mercer estate. He'd learned exactly where his wife had been spending her days. And he'd lost his mind. Not because she was working, because she'd done it without his permission, because she'd operated outside his knowledge, because for 4 months she'd had a life that he didn't control. And the idea of that, the idea that some part of her existed beyond his reach, was intolerable. The beating that followed was the worst she'd ever received. She'd ended up in the emergency room with a fractured rib, a concussion, and bruising so extensive that the doctor who treated her had called social services. But Craig had been there, sitting in the waiting room with tears in his eyes and a story about a fall down the stairs, and Briar, in the grip of a terror so deep it had become her normal, had confirmed his version. She'd quit the Mercer job the next day. Not because she wanted to, because Craig had told her, calmly, while she lay in bed with her rib wrapped, that if she ever went back to that house, he would find the little girl she'd been spending time with and teach Briar what real consequences looked like. He'd threatened Lily. And that was the moment Briar had understood, with the crystalline clarity that only mortal fear can produce, that she had to go. Not someday. Not when she was ready. Now. Before he carried out a threat that she knew in her bones, he was capable of following through on. She'd walked into Mrs. Calloway's office. She'd resigned. And she'd left without saying goodbye to Lily. Because if she'd seen that little girl's face, she wouldn't have been able to leave, and leaving was the only way to keep her safe. She'd gone home. She'd endured. She'd survived another 3 months of Craig's escalating violence while plotting, in the margins of her diminished existence, a way out. And then she'd discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy didn't slow Craig down. It accelerated him. And he saw the baby not as a life, but as leverage, another chain, another lock, another reason she could never leave. He told her that if she tried to run, he'd take the child. He told her no court would side with her because she had no money, no job, no family, and a psychiatric history that he'd fabricated by calling her doctor and reporting symptoms she'd never had. He hit her twice during the pregnancy. Once in the stomach. Theo was born in October at a hospital in Hoboken. In crying, he shoved Briar into a wall, hard crying. He shoved Briar into a wall hard enough to leave an indentation in the drywall. That was the night she ran. She waited until 2 a.m. She packed a diaper bag with formula, diapers, 3 onesies, and a thin blanket. She took $47 from the kitchen drawer, all the cash in the house. She left her phone because he tracked it. And she left her ID because he kept it in his safe. She left everything except the baby and the bag, and she walked out the back door into the November night, and she didn't stop walking until she reached the bus station. For 3 months, she'd lived in the margins. Shelters when they had space. Doorways when they didn't. She'd applied for assistance, but without an ID, without a fixed address, the system moved at a pace that assumed you had time. And Briar didn't have time. And she had a baby who needed formula and warmth, and a mother who wasn't shaking. She'd ended up in that alley on the coldest night of the year, not because she'd given up, but because every door she'd tried had been locked. When Declan heard this, not all at once, but in fragments over 2 days, pieced together from Briar's halting, in shame-filled confession, and from the background check his people had already begun running, he sat in his office on the 2nd floor and stared at the wall for a very long time. Then he picked up the phone. "Get me everything on Craig Devlin," he said to the man on the other end. "Employment, financials, criminal record, associations, every parking ticket, every late payment, every lie he's ever told. I want to know what he eats for breakfast and what side of the bed he sleeps on. And I want it by tomorrow morning." A pause on the other end. "And Declan?" "He threatened a child." "My child. Make sure that's in the file." He hung up. He looked at the wall, and for the first time in years, the cold calculation that usually governed his decisions was being edged aside by something hotter, something older, something that lived in the part of him that had held a newborn Lily in the hospital and sworn, silently, ferociously, in that no one would ever hurt the people under his protection. The circle of protection had just expanded. The first morning at the Mercer estate, Briar woke up confused. The bed was too soft. The room was too warm. The light coming through the bay window was too gentle, filtered through sheer curtains that turned the winter sun into something golden and benign. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then Theo made a small sound beside her. And reality rushed back in a wave that left her gasping. She was in Declan Mercer's home, in a guest room, with clean sheets and a space heater, and a stuffed bear named Mr. Bear sleeping next to her baby. She sat up, looked around. The room was bigger than the apartment she'd shared with Craig. There was a dresser with a vase of dried lavender, a bookshelf with novels and children's picture books, an ensuite bathroom visible through a half-open door, tiled in cream and gray. On the nightstand, someone had left a tray with a glass of water, 2 slices of toast, a small cup of fruit, and a note written in precise, slanted handwriting. Breakfast. Eat all of it. Dr. Amara will return at 10. Mrs. C. Briar stared at the note for a long time. Then she ate the toast, every crumb, and drank the water in one long, unbroken swallow. The shame hit her in waves throughout that first day. It wasn't rational. She knew that, on some intellectual level. She hadn't chosen her circumstances. And she'd fled violence. She'd protected her child. By any reasonable measure, she was the victim in this story, and the shame belonged to someone else entirely. But shame doesn't follow logic. It follows proximity. And Briar was standing inside the home of the most powerful man she'd ever met, wearing clothes that weren't hers, eating food she hadn't paid for, and accepting charity from a person she'd walked out on without explanation, and every molecule of her being was screaming that she didn't deserve it. She avoided the main areas of the house. She stayed in the guest suite with Theo, venturing out only when Mrs. Calloway personally came to escort her to meals. She ate quickly, kept her eyes down, and spoke only when spoken to. She washed her own dishes. She made the bed with hospital corners. She folded the towels precisely, and as though proving through domestic competence that she wasn't a burden. She kept waiting for the catch, for the moment when someone would tell her it was time to go, for the bill, for the condition, because in Briar's experience, kindness always came with a price tag. Craig had been kind too in the beginning. He'd been generous and attentive and warm, and every act of kindness had been a brick in the wall he was building around her. She'd learned through pain, to distrust generosity the way most people distrust darkness. So when Declan appeared in the doorway of the guest suite on the second evening and said, "We need to talk," Briar's first instinct was to reach for Theo and calculate the distance to the nearest exit. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. The distance between them was 10 feet, but it felt like a canyon. The gap between his world and hers, his power and her powerlessness, his composure and her terror. And I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself," Declan said. "You don't owe me an explanation. You don't owe me anything." Briar blinked. That wasn't what she'd been expecting. "But I need to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Can you do that?" She nodded. "Does your husband know where you are?" "No." The word came out instantly. "No. He doesn't know I'm in the state. I left. I didn't bring my phone. I changed my appearance. I've been careful. But he's looking for you?" It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. "He won't stop." "Why not?" "Because it's not about me. It's about Theo. Craig." She paused, swallowed. "Craig doesn't want a son. He wants a possession, something else to control, something else to own." Declan was quiet for a moment. The light from the window cast his face half in shadow, and in that shadow, his eyes were the color of storm clouds. He threatened my daughter." Briar's face went white. "Mr. Mercer, I swear to you, I left because of that. The moment he said it, I knew I had to go. I would never, ever let anything happen to Lily. That's why I quit without warning. That's why I didn't say goodbye. I was trying to protect." "I know." 2 words, spoken without accusation, without warmth, without anything except understanding. "I know why you left. I know what you were trying to do. And this is resolved. Not as a guest. Not as a guest, this is resolved. Not as a guest. Not as a charity case, as someone under my protection. That means my security team, my legal team, my resources. Do you understand? Mr. Mercer, I can't. This isn't a request. The words were hard, but his voice wasn't. There was something underneath the authority, something that sounded almost like asking. A good thing in your life to keep a good thing in your life, to keep a 6-year-old girl you didn't have to care about out of harm's way. You don't get to pay for that by freezing to death in an alley. Briar stared at him. Her eyes were full, her hands were shaking. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this? Declan held her gaze for a long moment. And when he answered, his voice was the quietest she'd ever heard it. Because my daughter sees who people really are, and she sees you. He stood, walked to the door, stopped. One more thing. You were the best person who ever worked in this house. Mrs. Calloway said so. Lily said so. I could see it myself. Whatever your husband made you believe about your worth, he was wrong about everything. He left. Briar sat in the silence of the guest room, holding her sleeping baby. Oh, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the shame didn't win. The file on Craig Devlin arrived the next morning. It was 47 pages long, compiled by an intelligence firm that Declan kept on retainer for situations exactly like this. Situations that required information to become ammunition. Declan read it alone in his office, a cup of black coffee growing cold beside him. Craig Devlin, age 31, born in Bergen County, New Jersey, on project manager at Caldwell Construction, a mid-tier firm with state contracts and a history of safety violations that had been mysteriously dismissed. Craig had 2 prior complaints of domestic disturbance on file, both withdrawn before charges were filed. He had a DUI from 2019 that had been pled down to a traffic violation. He had a gambling habit that had put him $40,000 in debt to a sports book in Atlantic City. He had a temper that 3 former co-workers had mentioned, off the record, as intense and unpredictable. He also had a record of searching Briar's name on social media daily. He'd filed a missing persons report 2 days after she left, and when the police hadn't moved fast enough for his liking, he'd hired a private investigator. The PI was still active. Declan closed the file. He sat still for a long time, his eyes fixed on the window, where the winter sun was painting weak stripes across the frost-covered lawn. And then he picked up his phone and called Victor Crane. Victor Crane was the Mercer family's attorney, not the corporate attorney who handled the legitimate business interests. The other one. The one who operated in the gray areas where law and power overlapped. He was 58 years old, bald, wore glasses with thin gold frames, and had a reputation in certain circles as the man who could make any legal problem disappear, not through corruption, but through a mastery of the system so complete that he could use its own rules against anyone who challenged his clients. Victor, I need a restraining order. Emergency protective order. Filed today. For whom? Briar Ashwood, against her husband Craig Devlin. I'm sending you the file now. There's documented domestic violence, threats against a minor, my minor, and evidence of ongoing stalking behavior. She's at the estate. She's under my roof, and she's staying there. A brief silence. Declan, if this man has hired a PI, it's a matter of time before he traces her to your property. The moment that happens, we're in a custody dispute with a man who will claim parental rights. That's why I want the protective order first. Then a full petition for sole custody on her behalf. Then a civil suit for domestic violence. Then, and this is important, Victor, I want every safety violation at Caldwell Construction reviewed by OSHA. I want his gambling debts flagged for his employer. And I want the 2 prior domestic disturbance complaints reopened. Another silence. Longer this time. You're going to dismantle his life. No, I'm going to expose his life. There's a difference. Everything I'm asking you to do is legal, documented, and verifiable. I'm not fabricating anything. I'm simply making sure that everything he's done catches up with him, simultaneously. Understood? I'll have the emergency order filed by end of day. Good. And Victor? If this one matters. They all matter, Declan. This one matters to my daughter. That was enough. Victor Crane began working within the hour. 3 days later, the shadow arrived. It was a Wednesday evening, just after 6. Briar was in the guest suite, feeding Theo. Lily was downstairs working on a drawing at the kitchen table. Declan was in his study, reviewing contracts when Ronan appeared in the doorway. Sir, we have an issue at the south gate. Declan looked up. Ronan's face told him everything he needed to know before the words came. There's a vehicle parked on the access road. Dark pickup. New Jersey plates. One occupant. He's been there for approximately 18 minutes. He's taking photographs of the gate and the perimeter wall. Declan closed the file he'd been reading, slowly. Do we have an ID? Plate comes back to a Craig Devlin, Bergen County. The room went quiet. Not the normal quiet of an empty study, but the heavy, impressurized quiet that precedes action. Is Lily in the house? Kitchen. Mrs. Calloway is with her. Briar. Guest suite, second floor. Lock down the property. Full protocol. Nobody in or out without my authorization. Declan stood. Don't engage the vehicle. Don't approach. I want eyes on him at all times. If he exits the vehicle, I want to know immediately. If he approaches the gate, I want to know before his hand touches the buzzer. Understood. And Ronan? On record. Ronan nodded and vanished on record. Ronan nodded and vanished. Declan stood at his window and looked out toward the south gate. He couldn't see the truck from this angle. It was a quarter-mile away beyond the tree line, but he didn't need to. He could feel it, the way a man who has spent his life navigating predators can feel another predator circling. He did not go to the gate. And he did not confront Craig Devlin. He did not send his men to intimidate, threaten, or harm. Instead, he sat down at his desk, opened his phone, and sent Victor Crane a text. He's here. Add stalking and surveillance to the filing. I want this served tomorrow. Then he went downstairs and sat beside Lily at the kitchen table and helped her color a drawing of a house with a garden and a yellow sun, and he didn't mention the truck, and he didn't mention danger. And he didn't mention the fact that every security camera on his property was recording, every guard was positioned, and every exit was monitored. Because this was how Declan Mercer fought. Not with fists, not with guns. With patience. With documentation. With the cold, meticulous assembly of a case so airtight that when it was presented, there would be no escape. Craig Devlin sat outside the gate for 43 minutes. Then he drove away. He didn't know it yet, but he'd already lost. 2 weeks passed, and in those 2 weeks, something happened inside the Mercer estate that was so gradual, so quiet, that it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Briar began to thaw, not all at once, not dramatically, in the same way ice melts in late February, unevenly, reluctantly, with frequent reversals, but moving in one direction nonetheless. The first sign was her posture. During the first few days, she'd moved through the house like a shadow, and shoulders hunched, making herself as small as possible, taking up as little space as she could manage. She walked close to walls. She spoke in near whispers. She flinched when doors closed. But by the end of the first week, her shoulders had begun to drop. Not relax, that would take longer, but descend from their permanent position near her ears to something that looked slightly less like a person bracing for impact. The second sign was her voice. She started speaking at normal volume, asking Mrs. The Calloway small questions. Is there anything I can help with? Where should I put Theo's bottles to dry? Can I use the washing machine? The questions were practical, domestic, unremarkable, but each one represented a tiny act of presence. A claim, however small, to space. The third sign was Lily. Lily had appointed herself Theo's unofficial guardian, caretaker, and entertainment committee. Every morning she arrived at the guest suite with the solemnity of a nurse beginning rounds. And she checked on Theo. She reported her findings to anyone who would listen. He smiled today. I think he's trying to grab things. She sat beside him on the bed and read to. She sat beside him on the bed and read to him in the same careful, expressive voice that Briar had once used to read to her. Briar watched this with an expression that shifted between gratitude and grief. In gratitude because Lily's kindness was so genuine it was impossible not to be moved by it. Grief because it reminded her of what she'd lost, those months of reading stories and building forts, the simple privilege of being part of a child's world. But over the days, the grief receded, and what remained was something warmer. Briar began to participate. She sat with Lily during reading time. She showed her how to support Theo's head. In she let Lily help with feedings, holding the bottle with focused concentration, whispering encouragements to a baby who had no idea what she was saying, but seemed to respond to the sound of her voice nonetheless. Briar? Lily asked one afternoon. Yes, sweetheart. Why did you leave before? The question hung in the air like a held breath. Briar looked at Lily, at those brown eyes that saw everything and forgave everything and felt the shame rise again. But this time she didn't let it win. Oni, I left to keep you safe, she said. Someone was being very mean to me, and I was afraid that if I stayed, they might be mean to you too. So I left, even though it broke my heart. Did it really break your heart? Completely. Lily thought about this for a moment. Then she said, with the devastating simplicity of a child, well, you're back now, so your heart can start fixing. Briar smiled. It was the first real smile she'd produced in months. It was small, fragile, and unsteady, but it was real. And it transformed her face in a way that made her look, for just a moment, like the woman she'd been before Craig Devlin had methodically erased her. There was a moment, during the second week, that no one witnessed, except Declan. It was late evening. The house was quiet. He'd been on his way to his office when he passed the open door of the guest suite and heard a sound that stopped him. Humming. Briar was sitting in the rocking chair by the window, Theo cradled in her arms, and she was humming. Softly, barely audibly, a melody he didn't recognize. Something slow and gentle. The kind of song that's been passed down through so many generations that no one remembers who wrote it. The baby was asleep, actually asleep. Not the fitful, trembling sleep of the alley, but the deep, boneless, total sleep of an infant who is warm, fed, and held by someone who loves him. His face was smooth. His breathing was even. Declan stood in the hallway and watched. Declan stood in the hallway and watched this scene, this unremarkable, extraordinary scene of a mother rocking her child to sleep in a warm room, and something in his chest that had been coiled tight for days finally released. He didn't enter the room. He didn't say anything. He just watched for a moment, then moved on down the hallway, in his footsteps silent on the hardwood. But he carried that image with him for a long time afterward. The baby who stopped shaking. The mother who started humming. The quiet, radical miracle of safety. The legal machinery Declan had set in motion arrived at Craig Devlin's door on a Tuesday morning at 7:15 a.m., just as he was leaving for work. The emergency protective order was served first. It barred him from coming within 500 feet of Briar, Theo, or any of their known locations. It referenced documented domestic violence, threats against a minor, and recent surveillance activity at a private residence. 2 hours later, a family court petition for sole custody was filed on Briar's behalf. It was accompanied by medical records, the hospital report from her fractured rib, the 2 prior domestic disturbance complaints, which had been reopened with the cooperation of the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, and a sworn affidavit from Dr. Amara detailing the condition in which Briar and Theo had been found. That afternoon, OSHA announced an investigation into Caldwell Construction's safety compliance record, but 3 current employees had come forward with complaints. Craig's supervisor received a call from HR about performance concerns. By the end of the week, Craig Devlin was facing a restraining order, a custody challenge, a criminal investigation, a potential job loss, and a gambling debt that his bookmaker, having heard through the grapevine that Craig was in legal trouble, had suddenly decided to call in. He didn't know who was behind it. He suspected, but he couldn't prove it because every action taken against him was legal, proper, and entirely above board. There was no intimidation, no threats, no shadowy figures delivering warnings, just the relentless, methodical application of systems and processes that Craig had spent years gaming, now turned with surgical precision against him. And this was how Declan Mercer fought. Not with violence, not with cruelty. With the devastating efficiency of a man who understood that the most powerful weapon in the world was not a gun. It was information applied correctly at the right one attempt to fight back. He hired a lawyer, a cheap one, because good lawyers were expensive and his finances were now under scrutiny. The lawyer advised him to file a counter petition for custody, in arguing parental rights and the absence of criminal conviction. Victor Crane dismantled the petition in a single hearing. He presented the medical evidence. He presented the police reports. He presented Craig's financial records, including the gambling debt and the evidence that he'd controlled Breyer's access to their joint account. He presented text messages recovered from Breyer's old phone, which the investigation team had obtained, and escalating abuse. The judge listened. The judge looked at Craig Devlin, who sat in his rumpled suit with his cheap lawyer and his barely contained rage. The judge looked at the evidence. The ruling was delivered within the week. Sole custody to Breyer. Supervised visitation only, pending completion of a court-mandated anger management program and a psychological evaluation. The restraining order was extended to 2 years. Craig Devlin walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps for a long time, looking at nothing. He drove back to an empty apartment. His job was on thin ice. His debts were closing in. The walls he'd built around another person had collapsed, and now the rubble was falling on him. No one from the Mercer organization contacted him. No one threatened him. No one needed to. The system, when properly activated, did its own work. Spring came to the Mercer estate the way it comes to places that have earned it, slowly, almost shyly, as though the warmth was checking to make sure it was welcome before committing. The maple trees along the driveway pushed out their first green buds. The lawn, which had been a gray-brown sheet of dormant grass, began to show streaks of color. Mrs. Calloway opened the windows in the kitchen for the first time in months. And the breeze that came through smelled like thawed earth and possibility. Breyer was still at the estate, but she wasn't the same person who'd arrived in February. The physical changes were obvious. She'd gained weight, not a lot, but enough that her face no longer looked like something stretched over bone. Her hair, which had been lank and unwashed, was clean and fell to her shoulders in soft waves. The dark circles under her eyes had faded from black to a faint lavender. Her hands, in which had been cracked and raw, were healing. But the real changes were subtler. She laughed sometimes. Not often, and usually at something Lily said. But the sound was there. A quiet, tentative thing, like a bird testing a new branch. She made eye contact when she spoke. She stopped apologizing for existing. She started sentences with, "I think," and "I want," instead of, "I'm sorry, but," and "if it's not too much trouble." She started helping Mrs. Calloway in the kitchen, not as a duty, but as something she enjoyed. She was a good cook, it turned out. Better than good. She had an instinct for flavor that Mrs. Calloway, who had been feeding the Mercer family for 15 years, openly admired. They developed a routine. Breyer would try a new recipe. Mrs. Calloway would taste it, make one suggestion, and nod approvingly, and Lily would be the final judge, delivering verdicts with the solemnity of a food critic and the enthusiasm of a 6-year-old. "Oh, this is the best soup in the whole world," Lily declared one evening, holding up her spoon. "And I have eaten soup in 4 states, so I know." Declan, sitting at the head of the table, looked at Briar over the rim of his glass and saw her smile. Really smile. The kind that reaches the eyes, and he felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with temperature. Theo was thriving at 5 months old. He was hitting every developmental milestone with the cheerful determination of someone making up for lost time. He smiled at everyone. He grabbed at everything. He discovered his own feet and treated them with the fascination of an explorer encountering a new continent. He slept through the night most nights, and on the nights he didn't, his cries were strong and healthy, not the thin, exhausted whimpers of the alley, but the full-throated demands of a baby who knew, with absolute certainty, in that someone would come. Someone always came. Usually Briar. Sometimes Mrs. Calloway. Once, on a night when Briar was sleeping deeply for the first time in months, Declan himself. He'd been passing the guest suite when he heard Theo fussing. He'd glanced in and seen Briar asleep, deeply, completely, the kind of sleep that the body takes by force when it has been deprived for too long. He'd hesitated for 1 second. Then he'd walked in, picked up the baby, and held him. Theo had looked up at him with those wide, unfocused infant eyes, and Declan had looked down at this tiny person who weighed less than a bag of flour and who, through no fault of his own, had been born into chaos and cold and fear. "Hey, kid," Declan had said quietly. "You're going to be fine, I promise." Theo had blinked. Then he'd grabbed Declan's thumb with both hands, and his face had crumpled into the concentrated, red-faced expression that precedes a burp. And he'd burped with a force that seemed impossible for someone his size, and then he'd fallen asleep. Declan had stood there for 10 minutes, holding a sleeping baby in the dark, and had thought about power, about what it meant, about what it was for, about who it should protect. 6 months later. The apartment was in a brownstone in Stamford, Connecticut. A 1-bedroom with hardwood floors, tall windows, and a small kitchen that Briar had already filled with herbs and spices. For one, Victor Crane's office had connected her with a nonprofit that specialized in placing survivors of domestic violence in stable employment. She'd started as an administrative assistant at a small family services organization, and within 3 months, she'd been promoted to intake coordinator. Because it turned out that Briar Ashwood, the woman who'd been told by her husband that she was nothing, had a natural gift for listening to people in crisis and making them feel seen. She was good at her job. She was good at it because she understood, in a way that no textbook could teach, what it felt like to be afraid, to be trapped, to sit across from someone and wonder if they were going to help you or hurt you. Theo was 9 months old now. He was enormous, in the 90th percentile for weight, which Dr. Amara attributed to excellent nutrition and possibly genetics, and definitely the fact that Mrs. Calloway had spent 3 months sneaking him extra portions of mashed sweet potato when no one was looking. He had 4 teeth, a vocabulary consisting primarily of "bye" and and an unshakable obsession with a stuffed bear named Mr. Bear that he would not sleep without. Lily visited every Saturday. Declan's driver would bring her in the morning, and she would spend the day at Briar's apartment, playing with Theo, helping Briar cook, drawing pictures that she taped to the refrigerator. She'd become, in effect, the world's most devoted older sister, a role she took so seriously that she'd started keeping a Theo log in which she documented his daily achievements, including entries like, "Theo clapped today. He's not very good at it yet, but he's trying." Briar and Lily had rebuilt their bond, and it wasn't the same as before. It couldn't be because both of them had changed, but it was deeper. It was the bond of people who had been through something together, even if they didn't fully understand what the other had experienced. It was based on trust, the real kind, the kind that's been tested and survived. On a Saturday in September, Declan came to pick Lily up at the end of the day. He usually sent the driver, but today he'd come himself. And he stood in the doorway of Briar's apartment and looked around. The space was small, but warm. There were plants on the windowsill, a drawing of a house. Lily's work was taped above the kitchen table. Theo was in a bouncer, chewing on Mr. Bear's ear. There was music playing softly from a speaker on the counter, something quiet, something gentle. Briar was standing by the stove, stirring something that smelled like rosemary and garlic. And she was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, and her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she looked like a person who lived here. Not a person who was hiding, not a person who was surviving, a person who was home. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without elaboration, without the desperate, shame-filled gratitude of their first days. Just two words, spoken between equals. "You did this yourself," Declan said. "No, I didn't." She looked at him. I didn't. I gave you a warm room and a phone number for a lawyer. Everything else, the job, the apartment, getting up every day, building a life from nothing, that was you. Don't give me credit for your courage." She held his gaze, and in that look was something that hadn't been there before. A steadiness, a solidity, the quiet confidence of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side with her hands open instead of clenched. "Lily is the reason," Briar said. You know that, right? She's the reason any of this happened. She saw me. In that alley, on the worst night of my life, a 6-year-old girl saw me when the rest of the world looked away." Declan nodded. Because he knew. He'd always known. "She gets that from her mother," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd mentioned Catherine in years. Then Lily came bounding into the room, holding a drawing she'd made of all four of them. Declan, Lily, Briar, and Theo, standing in a field of flowers under an enormous sun. "Look, Daddy, it's us. I made everyone smiling because everyone is smiling now." Declan looked at the drawing, at his daughter's face, at Briar's face, at the baby and the bouncer chewing on a stuffed bear that had started its life in a mansion and ended up in a one-bedroom apartment in Stamford and was arguably living its best life. He took the drawing. "This is going on my wall," he said. "The one in your office?" "The one everyone sees," Lily beamed, and Declan Mercer, who had spent his entire life measuring power and fear, in how many people moved when he spoke, in how many doors opened when he approached, in how many problems dissolved when he applied the weight of his name, understood in that small, sunlit apartment that he'd been measuring wrong. Power wasn't fear. It never had been. Power was the ability to stand between someone and the thing that was trying to destroy them. And to say, "Not here, not on my watch, not ever." Power was a little girl who saw a freezing baby and said, "Daddy, help." Power was a woman who ran from a monster with nothing but a diaper bag and $47 and survived. Power was choosing who to protect and meaning it. He drove home that evening with Lily asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window, the sunset painting her face in shades of gold and amber. The road unwound before him. The world outside was green and warm and full of the reckless, unapologetic beauty of early autumn. On the dashboard, Lily's drawing was propped against the windshield. 4 figures. A field of flowers. An enormous sun. Everyone smiling because